Well, we're recording this a few days before July 4th, Dr. Fleming, and as you learn more in history from what we were taught in school, I think for many of us, our relationship with July 4th becomes more complicated. Living in France as a non-French citizen, it was easy for me to react to July 14th. I would leave the country.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be in the country for a holiday commemorating the murder of priests and nuns. That wasn't anything I was going to celebrate. But as an American, being here for July 4th, when I was younger, it's hot dogs, it's baseball, apple pie, trucks, veterans parades. But as I say, if you learn more history, it gets more complicated. And you've said that when you think about July 4th, you think in terms of two different groups of people, and that they're both wrong.
Yeah. The first is, you might call it the old sort of super patriot myth that lasted down to the end of the 1950s into the 60s, that we're told that it's the beginning of a revolution for the liberation of mankind. You get the Declaration of Independence, then sort of slips into Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, and it becomes the foundation of the Constitution, and that these were geniuses, that they were original political thinkers who came up with something brand new, unanticipated anywhere else, that we are uniquely good and virtuous. So I was watching there's a Italian singer. He's been dead for 15 years now, Giorgio Gaber, and he used to do stand-up routines as well, and he would have this one routine about America. Oh, the Americans are wonderful. They have jet planes, skyscrapers, and their culture. Well, no, they don't have any culture. And finally, he says, the Americans are the only people who, when they go and bomb some country to shreds and invade it and take everything over, it's just for their own good. Now, and by the way, Giorgio Gaber was not. He was very opposed to the Italian left. So, but on the other hand, you get what they started teaching in the 60s is that the whole American experience is one long saga of burning Indians, lynching Negroes, beating wives, torturing children, which is, I think, these alternate myths, one grows out of the other, and then they look each other in the mirror and they keep on perpetuating themselves. The revolution had some practical causes, and some of them were good, some of them were bad. One branch of my family said they had enough and they went to Canada because they had been Highland Scots who had taken a Highland oath, and also because it was often forgotten. And if you lived in the Carolinas, especially in the backcountry, the Scots were not liked because they were felt to be protégés of the Duke of Argyll. And they were given jobs that people resented their having these jobs. Their property was stolen during the Revolution. They were never, they were one of the first historians of America. He was a Scotsman. He fled persecution, and he fought in the courts for years. But the states would simply repudiate debts, and they didn't do the right thing. On the other hand, the British government was acting very foolishly under provocation in New England, and closing the port of Boston, depriving people, suspending the Charter of Massachusetts. All of these things were acts of petty tyranny, which tended to arouse the already unhappy Yankees. So there were. It's not that there were no causes, and it's not that the Americans who rose up were not brave, both as fighters and as political leaders. It is good. Many good people in England thought George Washington was one of the greatest British heroes of all time. I mean, they compare him to Alfred the Great and other people. Of course, there's Dr. Johnson said the Americans are a race of convicts worth hanging. And he also wrote a pamphlet, Taxation, No Tyranny. But there is nothing particularly original or brilliant in the Declaration. The Declaration, for example, is after they list a bunch of crimes committed by the British government. Some of them are true. Some of them, frankly, are made up. This whole business a lot about putting soldiers in people's houses and things like that.
That's the Fourth Amendment.
Yeah, this was this wildly overstated. It was done by every government in the world all the time, and so you just can't start making your story up. The rest of it was this propaganda. You know, we hold these truths to be self-evident. But anytime anybody tells you that, you better reach for your wallet before they do. It's a series of just monstrous lies. All men are created equal, and Jefferson didn't want them to, but give it to us by God. He definitely disliked that one. But you take these cliches of 17th century Whig political philosophy in England, John Locke and some of the others. It wasn't just specifically Locke. It was just the cliches of the Whig Party, and they were designed so that the country gentry and the big merchants could challenge the power of the king. And as Dr. Johnson again said, the first devil, the devil was the first Whig, because he challenged legitimate authority. So there are many good things they did, and the best is summed up in the 10th Amendment, is they did not try to make an amalgamated nation state. They made a confederation of equal members, and that's why the U.S. Senate, California has two senators, and North Dakota has two senators, because they're equal partners in the American Confederal Union. Now, all of that was good, except that since the 1860s, the United States has been systematically destroying the things that made our Constitution work. And if people would quit honoring the Constitution by waking me up at 2 in the morning with their fireworks on June 28th, which happened, and behave themselves and study the history of their country and maybe actually read the Constitution and the Declaration, they might be able to begin to see why we had certain advantages. For one thing, what other country in the world started with, I don't know how many millions of square miles of open territory to go in and dispossess the Indians of?
I was going to say fruitful forests, wonderful soil, lakes, navigable waterways, all these things that other countries would dream of having.
That's right.
And Americans attribute this to themselves. We have this amazing, wonderful, abundant country, as if they invented the trees, as if they invented the waterways. Part of America's success has been a fairly apologetic, peaceful neighbor to the north, a failed state to the south, and giant water barriers from other nations who would seek to do us harm. So part of America's prosperity was being able to flourish in peace, and that's how we got salutary neglect in the first place. America was allowed to prosper over on the other side of the water.
That's right. But all that changed, of course, starting with the war between the states and the Indian Wars. We got our ruling class got a taste for blood and other people's treasure and other people's land. I mean, the Spanish-American War is a terrible thing that we did. It was one thing on the basis of a lie to go and drive the Spanish out of Cuba, but when the Filipinos had just about finished their revolution driving this, we said we had to go in there and teach them about democracy. We killed hundreds of thousands of civilians in our lesson on democracy for the Filipinos. Why they do not resent us more, I don't understand.
Well, there's a huge amount of resentment. I'm remembering, I think it was Grover Cleveland who said that we needed to evangelize our little brown brothers, forgetting that they'd been Catholics probably for 200 years at that point. But the Filipino, going even closer, post 1950s, and the sort of cruelty that was used in putting down some rebellions there. But Jim Easton mentioned at dinner the other night that he remembered the 200th anniversary, because we're coming up on the 250th.
Yes.
And I thought you might help us compare and contrast. Some of us were not around for the 200th.
Yes, Fleming. Well, I certainly was.
What was different about America then and now? And what do you see us celebrating for 250?
In the 1970s, it seemed to me and a number of people that we had been going in the wrong direction for nearly 100 years, that the pace had accelerated, and that often under a good slogan or a good flag, like equal justice for people of all races, that's a good idea. Having the federal troops occupy the states is not a good idea. But that marriage was breaking down. People act as if somehow the 60s went away in the 1970s. They didn't. It's just become institutionalized. The Reagan Revolution about to take place was no revolution at all. It was, as they said of Napoleon, he defeated the revolution by institutionalizing it. And so the 70s and 80s were a period in which all the wrong things we'd been doing for a long time, and yet you could still, the country was much safer. There were neighborhoods you didn't want to go to, but other than that, you could walk down most streets of most cities most of the time. We were living in a small village. We not only didn't lock our doors, our windows didn't have locks. I would leave every night the car keys on the seat so I'd know where to find them in the morning.
It's still like that in some American small towns.
So I asked a friend of mine who grew up in a town. I said, "Well," he said, "Well, because I jokingly said, because he had built my house," and I said, "We need locks." And he says, "What for?" And he said, "What happens if you lock your house up and your neighbor needs to borrow your chainsaw?" I said, "You wouldn't want that. I mean, And there was a lot of that was still residual in the United States. Marriage was much more stable. Teen life was, the life of children was much simpler, and everything. So if you were like 20 years younger than I am, Jim Easton is only like 8 years younger or something. But if you're 20 years younger and you grew up like you were born in 1965 or something, and you would say, well, those were halcyon days. You could watch Leave It to Beaver reruns on TV or whatever, and in comparison, they were. It's like I used to talk to the guy who hired me at the Rockford Institute, John Howard, and he said they never locked their house. They would leave for days and never lock their house. He grew up both here and elsewhere, but the whole country. Now, my mother once thought we had a prowler when I was about 10 years old, but it wasn't. It was some animal, probably a bear wandering in from the woods. But yes, things have really gone bad. But what I ask people to do is, first of all, not to quit loving your country just because it's not perfect. Work on what you can in your own neighborhood, in your own life to make things better. But second of all, not to accept this lie that somehow we're exempt from the historical foibles of the human race. We're the same people that our ancestors were. We're the children of Adam and Eve. And we have the same proclivities. We make the same mistakes over and over and over. And just because we have a pretty good constitution on paper, that means that's not why we were a good country to live in. Clyde Wilson, who's a very fine historian, used to say, constitutions don't make a people. People make a constitution. So, for example, when former slaves were bought and sent to Liberia to form a colony for ex-slaves, very few people wanted to go. By the way, they took the American Constitution and enacted it, and then proceeded to have one of the most gaudy, repressive, and corrupt regimes in the history of the continent of Africa. I mean, just unbelievable. The American slaves, of course, having more education and having seen an example, they then immediately, of course, became the dictators and the oppressors of the natives they had come to join. The paper, Russia outlawed, I think in the 1920s or whatever, it outlawed capital punishment. So I guess Stalin didn't kill anybody.
Right, it's just that, if you outlaw guns, you have gun
that's
control,
right, that's
nobody
right.
will get shot.
Famously, during the debates leading up to the war between the states, in a debate in the Senate, one Yankee senator said, why can't the South follow suit? We in the North have outlawed slavery. James Henry Hammond, the senator from South Carolina, quite a controversial character, he stood up and said, the name, sir, but not the thing. knowing perfectly well that wage slavery, there have been commissions from Britain. People work to study working conditions in factories and mines compared with slavery, and they concluded slaves were infinitely better off. They had more free time, better diet, they could sell their labor on the side. That was paradise compared to the average factory worker in the North. But quit getting deluded by words like all men are created equal. We know that's not true. And the attempt to make it true means, like, if you had a 6 foot guy and a 5 foot guy, well, you could give vitamins to the 5 foot guy or just cut a foot off the top of the 6 footer. And that has been our history of equality.
Well, you could identify as a 6 footer these days.
Oh, absolutely.
You don't have to worry about that. And as you're saying that, I think if foreigners ask me, what does July 4th mean to you? How do you celebrate? And as I said, I learn more about our history, and I'm disabused of some of those ideas I had in my youth. I come back to, well, what do I love? I love Americans. I love this land. I love the beauty of the land. I love the good that I see Americans do to each other. I certainly don't love the bad things that are happening. The one question I feel that is most burning in our time as we hit the 250th anniversary, that I wondered, did you see at all as a shadow in the 200th, was immigration. Was there a question of this in the 70s, of this is going to be a major problem, or did people bandy about, well, we're a nation of immigrants?
That's right. That was the constant line. It was in all the textbooks, I remember. At the Ellis Island, everybody was proud to have an Ellis Island ancestor. It started about the serious concern started in the very early 80s. I can remember going to Washington, D.C. Before I became editor at Chronicles, and I was with Sam Francis, and who was already very concerned about immigration, and we met Palmer Stacey, who was an aide, I believe, to Jesse Helms, or maybe to Senator East. And we started talking about the immigration problem because the numbers were looking pretty grim, especially for immigration across our southern border from Latin America, mainly 90% coming from Mexico. And so for some reason, I knew Sam was fond of Evelyn Waugh, so I made an allusion to an Evelyn Waugh novel. Palmer Stacey stands up. I said, "Where are you going, Palmer?" He said, "If we're not going to talk about immigration, I'm leaving." I said, Palmer, there's more to talk about in life than just the immigration. He said, "Yes, but if we don't get that solved in the next year or two, there won't be a country." You won't. And
he said this in the early 80s.
Yeah. And I thought, and I took, so among the first changes I made, by 85, we were writing small editorials on how, conflicts between two different ethnic groups in America would result in a riot. And long before we came out with our infamous issue that got us denounced everywhere, A Nation of Immigrants. But yeah, nobody thought this. But, in looking back, I remember being really surprised in the mid-90s I was back in South Carolina and driving out to Camp St. Christopher for some meeting, which is an Episcopal church campground, but they have resort facility and everything. And I saw some Mexicans standing in a line for a job, and I said, "What are Mexicans doing west of the Ashley?" He said, "Oh yeah, we got a lot of seasonal migrant workers, etc." I said, "I'd never seen a Mexican in South Carolina before." And when I was when I lived in northern Wisconsin, I didn't know that I didn't know what a taco was. When we moved to Rockford, they had Taco Bell and Taco John's, and I tried it. It was disgusting. I had no idea that Mexican food is actually an excellent cuisine. We may take you out to a Mexican restaurant tonight, but that is how weird it was. Can you imagine? You can't, if you drive into any town the size of Rockford, you'll drive around for an hour and you'll see 50 Mexican restaurants. There are more Mexican restaurants than American restaurants. Now, that's because, and even if all the immigrants were the nicest people in the world, if they were educated, affable, wealthy contributors to society, it's still a mistake. and because they're not us and we're not them. If 100 million Americans descended on Italy, Italy would be a different country. You wouldn't want that. And my friend Jean Raspail, who wrote Camp of the Saints and was denounced for it, he was also a defender of a Latin American group, Patagonia. It's a very primitive people, and he wrote this book, Who Will Save the Men? That is, the human beings, because that's what because they're dwindling, mostly both between more developed Indians, but mostly Europeans. They're oil drilling, their lands are being taken away, and they live at sea mostly. And the point is that any authentic culture, you should take a view, an ecological view. These people are an ecosystem, and they have exploited their environment. They've developed a culture in order to do it, and to ruin it as by bringing in Coca-Cola and all of that stuff, to go into a primitive country and ruin its economic base and destroy its culture, which is, though the left is very angry about that, but it's okay to import those people here who do the same thing to us in different ways. People as similar to each other as Swedes and Norwegians have trouble getting along. Imagine what people would say. Well, what we need to do is let in all the Chinese who can put down $100,000. But we're not Chinese. The Chinese have one of the two oldest civilizations in the world. They have well-defined characteristics which between this, what my friend E.O. Wilson used to call gene-culture feedback, and they've developed into a unique population. They don't need us ruining them, and we don't need them ruining us. But I often think of the first C.S. Lewis science fiction novel, Out of the Silent Planet, and where they're on Mars, and there are like 3 or 4 different civilized races, intelligent races on Mars. One is sort of like beavers, another are sort of look like praying mantises, but they're very intellectual. Another group is very artistic, and they have to meet to meet the threat of this Earthman landing. Now, what are they going to discuss? And so they're staying at this big inn, which is adjusted for all their different needs. The beavers sort of live next to in the hut in the water, and they're all making ethnic jokes about each other. Because Lewis says people from different backgrounds can't get together without diffusing the hostility through humor. But we're not even allowed to make ethnic jokes. So no, people, as I say, there were a few people, for example, on the Sierra Club, who saw things in environmental terms, who realized, they said, America's environmental problem is caused by overpopulation. The native population, black and white, is not growing. All our growth is through immigration and through the children of immigrants. And so people like Gaylord Nelson, senator from Wisconsin, people like Dick Lamb, senator from Colorado, and there were a few others on the board of the Sierra Club. They got kicked out because they were telling the truth about the environment. And that's when I got to know them. I was at a lot of meetings with them, because I treated it. It's not just a question of the money we spend. That kind of argument doesn't go anywhere. But unfortunately, it is the myth of American exceptionalism, because we're a nation of immigrants. We accept anybody. They adopt immediately and perfectly to our way of life. They don't. I know a lot of very nice Scandinavian people in the Midwest, and many of them don't speak very good English, because they're 3rd generation, 4th generation, but nobody in their family ever learned correct English. They don't, and these are people. One or two of them have PhDs. They don't resonate with American cultural traditions, because they have Scandinavian traditions, which are good. They're wonderful traditions. But
in Scandinavia.
They're not us. And
I reminded Joan of Arc when she's being questioned. It says, "Well, don't you love the English?" And she said, "Yes, at home."
Yes, exactly.
So if they're keeping those Scandinavian traditions, it's not as coherent here in America.
But the immigration dilemma is a direct result of the false teaching of American exceptionalism, which goes back to over-interpreting the Declaration of Independence and the events is 1776. By the way, I would ask everybody to forget calling it July 4th. Which there's, when you call something July 4th or like 14 July or September 22nd in Italy, they have all these they're revolutionary dates. We have Independence Day. And so, and let's not associate our independence, let's not give it the same ugly Marxist twang as 14 Juillet.
Yes, yes, an even more murderous, horrible holiday. But
Yeah.
two more questions, Dr. Fleming. I feel that even though I wasn't around, that at the 200th birthday, one could coherently, I could go on the street and I could ask 10 people, what does it mean to be an American? And there would be some consensus that I could get.
Yes.
But if I tried to do that today, it was near 250, people, I would maybe get 10 different answers.
Yeah.
But most of it would be around, people seeking opportunity,
Yes,
which
right.
makes me feel like we're all coworkers at a job.
Yes, well, I can remember in the 80s, I had wealthy board members telling me, well, see, these people, the minute they come here, they're better Americans than descendants of George Washington because they're willing to work hard for low wages. And they understand that this is, I remember Dinesh D'Souza, this total idiot who writes books on subjects he knows nothing about. When I was giving a lecture at the Heritage Foundation, and about this very question, what does it mean to be an American? I thought America was just a place where you would come and do your own thing. I said, we were taught wrong.
And now he's seen as
Yeah,
flag bearer for these ideas.
Oh, I know. He's the same guy who he wondered why, when he was cheating on his wife and brought his mistress down to some kind of evangelical meeting, they didn't tell me I couldn't do that.
All right, last question, Dr. Fleming. I don't know that either of us will be around for 300th.
I think I can pretty much guess on that one.
What do you foresee for the American Republic at its 300th anniversary if it makes it to that time?
Well, it's already not a republic. It's already a dictatorial empire, and it doesn't really matter who's president because every president almost in my lifetime has been a crook or a buffoon. Perhaps in the present case, both. But he's better than his predecessors. What a thing to have to say. But the country gets noticeably worse in all respects. Once every 5 or 10 years. I mean, where you could say, "Oh, remember how good it was when we could do X 10 years ago?" And you think it. Well, I remember people saying, "Oh, same-sex marriage, that's the end." And I said, "Oh, no.
This is only the beginning."
No. First we got the transgender. Well, transgender's actually it. Oh, no, we've got American states now considering overturning incest laws. And Germany overturning incest laws.
Who are you to judge?
Yeah.
If there is no God,
Yes.
then why does it matter?
But things that the creepiest pagan societies forbade, we can now. And there are people who like in China. There's a guy. There are people marrying their pets.
I think there was a lady in China who married her AI boyfriend.
Yes, and then there's this furry movement in America. You dress up as like a stuffed animal, and you hold orgy meetings. You take over hotels, and God help the person who didn't realize what the party was, because it's. But you think, well, okay, that's it, right? But no, there's always one step beyond. And AI presents, now they've got AI pornography, they're developing robotic prostitutes. I mean, Blade Runner looks like a quaint book about the past. But at least in Blade Runner, they had some idea of fighting back. Philip K. Dick, a writer of many eccentricities and many deplorable habits, but he really did see the future better than
Really
most.
Fascinating ideas from him. Well, I think that's a grim way to finish, Dr. Fleming, but I don't think we could finish any other way insofar as this is where we're headed. And in the meantime, as you've always said, making the most of a dark age, just because things are falling apart around you doesn't mean that you cannot do well within your own circumstances, within your own family, within your own communities. And do your best to create communities around you where you don't have to lock the doors.
Well, exactly. And one of the things, people say, oh, this is the worst period in the history of the world. Well, maybe right. But, the period in which Attila was rampaging across Europe, raping and murdering and burning and slaughtering en masse. And then when he left, everybody starves to death. We have great affluence, and if you just learn to quit surfing the net, except for this, of course, and quit watching bad movies on television, to take charge of your own life, it would be a different world. I saw on YouTube a few days ago where some guy sets up with a flute and a violin background. There's going to play something, and a guy with one arm comes up, and he says, "I can play the flute." And he's got this weird, pan pipe, huge.
This was in Gare de Lyon, and then some
yes,
other kids
that's right.
show
One
up,
by,
yes.
and before long, they're doing this brilliant two-flute rendition of the Vivaldi concerto, the winter version. And of course, the camera then pans the audience. People are weeping.
Yeah, people are crying.
Yeah, spontaneous beauty makes them weep. Well, what if they put on a Kanye West show?
Weeping for different reasons.
Yeah.
And I suppose I just add on top of that, Dr. Fleming, that supernaturally, this was the time from all eternity that God willed you to be alive.
Yes.
And there's a reason for that, and it's up to you to discover that and act it as best.
Well, there is fun. Somebody once asked Albert J. Nock, and H.L. Mencken, well, you're always complaining about this. Why don't you go someplace else? And Mencken's answer was that I'm a half-educated man. I go to someplace like England or France. It's hard for me to have a career here. I'm the one-eyed man who's king in a land of the blind. And Knox's answer was he had Isaiah's job. That is, my job in life is to denounce the sins of my generation and having a great time doing it.
Well, thank you for helping to denounce some things, Dr. Fleming, and happy Independence Day to you.
And to you, and to our listeners and